The French Revolution set Europe ablaze. It was an age of enlightenment and progress, but also of tyranny and oppression. It was an age of glory and an age of tragedy. One man stood above it all. This was the Age of Napoleon. I'm Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon podcast. Join me as I examine the life and times of one of the most fascinating and enigmatic characters in modern history. Look for the Age of Napoleon wherever you find your podcasts.
I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center. A few years ago, learning about the forgotten meaning of the pursuit of happiness changed my life. When the founders wrote that famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence, they meant an ongoing commitment to self-improvement and lifelong learning. This discovery inspired me to write a book, and in my new podcast, I explore the founders' lives with the historians who know them best. Plus, filmmaker Ken Burns shares his daily practice of self-reflection. Join me for Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 61 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. You can't see my face right now, but I'm wearing shock. Christmas is just 3 days away. Now, I'm sure my shock has to do with the fact that I'm wondering, where did 2015 go? But I haven't started my holiday wrapping yet. I don't know what it is about gift wrapping, but each and every year, it's the one task I procrastinate. This is a wondrous thing in our household because I am not a procrastinator. But each and every year, I put off the gift wrapping. So just know that if you haven't started your holiday wrapping yet, you're in great company. Now, while I may not be excited about gift wrapping, I am really excited about Christmas. Tim and I have a great day planned. We're going to drive up to New Hampshire and spend the holiday with my parents, my brother, our 3-year-old niece, Addison, and our 10-month-old nephew, Harrison. And Addison seems really excited about Christmas this year. I think she finally understands Santa, and she's really interested to see if she's been a good girl this year. And I can assure you she has. And whether Santa leaves presents under her tree. So Tim and I can't wait to see her reaction when she finds some gifts under her Christmas tree. I hope that you and your family have an equally wonderful day planned. I wish you and your family a very Merry Christmas. And if you don't celebrate Christmas, I still hope you have a great day and that you get to do something enjoyable. Okay, on to history. If you had only 6 years to enjoy retirement, what would you do? Would you improve your plantation, build canals, or work behind the scenes to unite your country by framing a new central government? These are just some of the activities that George Washington undertook during his brief retirement from public service between 1783 and 1789. Believe it or not, we are going to explore an understudied aspect of George Washington's life today with Edward Larson, a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and author of The Return of George Washington, 1783 to 1789. During our exploration, Ed reveals how and why George Washington retired from government and military service after the War for American Independence, the activities Washington undertook during his retirement period, and why Washington felt compelled to return to public service in 1787 during the Constitutional Convention. But first, if you love this show and would like to help support it, please consider making a contribution to our crowdfunding campaign. Your financial support will help the show continue to sound great, and it will help me expand the offerings and educational opportunities provided by Ben Franklin's World. To learn more, text Support BF World to 33444 or visit benfranklinsworld.com/movement. Thank you very much for your consideration. And now, let's go meet our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is a professor of history at Pepperdine University. He is the winner of the Pulitzer Prize in History, and today he joins us to discuss his book, The Return of George Washington, 1783 to 1789. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Edward Larson.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to do anything connected with Ben Franklin.
Ed, George Washington, as you know, served as the first commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. He had served prior to that in the French and Indian War, and later he would serve as the United States' first president. There are so many books written about Washington. Why did you choose to write a book about Washington in between his service as commander-in-chief and as first president?
Because no one has written a book about it. You're absolutely right. There are endless books about Washington. They could fill a library. I'm sure one person, when I was introduced, once told me he'd looked up on Google and found out that there were over 20,000 books with George Washington in the title in some way, title or subtitle. But this period, the period between when he steps down as commander-in-chief, or effectively actually with the Battle of Yorktown, which effectively ended the Revolutionary War, which was in 1781. The peace treaty was signed in 1783. And there are good works about those 2 years, about Washington winding down the war. There are good books about that. But then he doesn't become president until 1789. And so there's, however you want to count it, there 4, 5, 6 years in this in-between period when Washington retired, as it were, was using his phrase, back to his plantation in Virginia. And those periods tend to get lost, even in the biographies, the multi-volume biographies about George Washington, and there's some excellent ones. This period either gets skipped over, or they talk about Washington as a farmer, as a planter. And that's a great story. Washington was a planter and a farmer, and a very, very imaginative one. And you get to see it during that period, but you also can see it later in his life and earlier in his life. What they leave out is what he was doing as a public citizen during that period. And he was the most famous person in America and a world hero for having freed the colonies. And so I want to probe into that period.
I would like for us to look at George Washington's retirement, but before we get to his retirement, we should actually look at the process by which he resigned as commander-in-chief. I mean, that's a really interesting act because Europeans were really surprised when he turned in his resignation to Congress in December 1783, but Americans were not all that surprised. Would you explain why Europeans and Americans held such different views about Washington's resignation?
Europeans were surprised because it differed from their experience. Even during the war, the British propagandists, in their letters, articles, broadsheets to the American people saying, why are you revolting against one King George, that is King George III, only to get another King George and King George Washington? They would argue that all rebel leaders become tyrants. That is, they can't give up power. And so they could point to Cromwell in England, who very few could argue didn't have the best of intentions, and yet he can't give up power. Caesar, the various different Roman emperors. Of course, if they could go a few years ahead, they'd have Napoleon as probably the greatest example of all time. Time after time, and more recently, whether it be Lenin or Mao or Castro in Cuba or whoever, rebel leaders have a very difficult time giving up power. And so this surprised them. They thought he would cling to power. Now, Americans did view it somewhat different. Perhaps they were just more naive in the sense that Washington always said he was going to retire. When he first took the job, he said he takes on the soldier, he does not give up the citizen. The Americans were steeped in this Enlightenment idea of sort of the citizen soldier and the citizen who was a leader. That is, you'd go into office and you'd come back out of office. That was something of a colonial norm. And Washington said he'd step down. So when he did step down, certainly the people were delighted. They were pleased that he had done what they expected him to do. But in a way, it is indeed what they expected. And so there's the famous exchange that has gone down in history that one of America's great painters, John Trumbull, was then over in England, and the King of England asked him at an event, says, well, what do you think Washington will do when the war is over? And Trumbull replies, well, he'll step down. And King George, or at least that's the way Trumbull reports it, King George says, well, if he does that, he will be the greatest person in the world. That was the different view between the what was in Europe and what was in America.
What was it about Washington that made him different? Why was he so willing to relinquish power when others would have clung to it?
Well, I'm not so sure all Americans would have clung to it. I'm not sure that a Ben Franklin would have clung to it, or a Thomas Jefferson, or even a John Adams. But Washington, like many of the other leaders in the American Revolution, truly had a sense of Republican virtue that springs out of that Enlightenment period. They were children of the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment had captured, whether you're looking at Montesquieu or Locke, had this notion of the government by the consent of the governed, and that the monarchy is out of fashion, and there's a sense of liberty, individual duty and responsibility. Washington believed those things. He lived in the experience where people would go into the Virginia, either House of Burgesses or the Virginia Council, and serve for a time, but still remain citizens, still remain planters and farmers, that being a political leader had not become their full-time job. It was a place of service. Benjamin Franklin reflected that. And also the resources you'd get. Their wealth, if they had it, was tied to their vocation. So Washington's wealth always came from his plantation and his landownings. And the better the country was running, the better the state was running, the more profitable the plantation was at the time, and the more profitable the land he held. Benjamin Franklin didn't make, when he held office, made his money as a printer, not in whatever political office he held at the time. And so for their own financial well-beings, and of course you could add that America was a land of economic opportunity, so economically they would probably be better out of office. Certainly that was the case in Washington. His plantation on somewhat played-out tobacco land was tied to his actual presence there and active day-to-day, hands-on management of the place. He could make that plantation profitable. No one else could. His wealth came from the plantation. So you're laying down on philosophical grounds, on economic grounds, on a whole variety of grounds. Retirement simply made more sense and was more reflective of the person. Also, one more addition, Washington always cared greatly about his legacy. How he would be remembered. He cared deeply about, even as a child, he said that was his goal, to make a difference. Again, that's reflective of this period of the Enlightenment where you feel that way. And his legacy was tied to public service, but also stepping down from public service and living out the virtues that he spoke about. Years later, Napoleon would say, when this is all over, Washington is going to be remembered as a hero and I'm going to be remembered as a tyrant. And that was, Washington thought the same way, realized the same way. So again, not only do you add economics and practical effects and basic ideas and virtues, but his long-term reputation was tied to him stepping down.
Washington retires on December 23, 1783. What does retirement mean in the late 18th century? What did Washington do now that he's no longer the head of the Continental Army?
Of course, the United States didn't have Social Security back then, and it didn't have Medicare. And no one was going to take care of you when you were retired except maybe your children. And Washington had no children. So retirement simply meant shifting folks. Now, he did call it retirement, but it was retirement from military service. He was going to go back and run his plantation. He wasn't going to go down to Florida and play golf and collect Social Security or collect his pension. There were no pensions. His whole economic well-being was tied to making this plantation profitable. So he was simply shifting. For retirement for him simply meant shifting from day-to-day management of the American Army and, in a way, the whole American government, because the Army was the main activity of the government and he had to be a top advisor for the government, shifting to managing his main plantation in Mount Vernon, which by this time was a combination of a variety of nearby farms. So it was actually a very large plantation with, probably 500 or more workers, half of them slaves and the rest, most of the rest indentured servants, plus a vast array of holdings that he'd acquired on the frontier in upstate New York and in other places. So he had more than a full-time job when he retired.
Washington didn't go to Florida to play golf, which probably would have been awkward if he had, since it was owned by the British. But he definitely had some sort of, shall we say, hobbies. And one of those hobbies seemed to be the idea of inland navigation and pushing that cause to being built. Would you tell us about inland navigation and Washington's interests in it?
Again, inland navigation hardly became a hobby. It became another full-time job. It would be a full-time job for anyone else. Inland navigation, you can sort of slash that with canaling. This was an era before railroads. And what had been happening in Europe, and Washington and many other Americans very closely followed, they viewed themselves more as Europeans than they really did as Americans, in the sense that they were trying to create a better Europe in the New World. And at this time, recently actually, at that time in the previous maybe 50 years, the Industrial Revolution had begun to take hold in Europe, and to get goods to market and also to get raw materials to the manufacturing sites, there'd been a rage of canal building in France and in England and somewhat in Germany and Ireland and in other places. They were digging canals across the land, and these canals or water, and often it was just dredging and deepening existing rivers, so that you could carry massive amounts of goods to market from factories. This was obviously going to be necessary in the United States. They didn't have railroads, and so they started building some canals. But what Washington saw was even bigger than that. Washington saw, and it wasn't, again, just Washington, most of the American leaders, and you can see this just as clearly in Benjamin Franklin, believed that what made America different was the frontier. They would look and say, why are we such a virtuous people? Why do we have so much opportunity here? You look at Europe, and basically people were still serfs. If you were born as a peasant, you were going to die as a peasant. The French Revolution hadn't yet happened. This is what was happening in France, but it was also happening in England. If your parent was a lord, you're going to be a lord, and if your parent was a miller, you're going to be a miller. The place was full up. Now, they didn't notice that in America. You could have a person like a Ben Franklin who literally escaped from some sort of service with his brother and go to a new town, Philadelphia, and become a very, very wealthy and successful printer. George Washington's family, of course, had come out and carved a place for them on the frontier, what was then the frontier, and Washington's own future before the Revolution, he tied to acquiring land. After he'd serviced during the French and Indian War, he acquired significant lands on the frontier. He'd become a frontier surveyor and had worked on the frontier, so he knew the frontier. By the frontier, then we mean the Ohio River Valley, what's now western Pennsylvania, the state of West Virginia, then part of Virginia, and maybe across into what's now Ohio, that basic area. So all Americans believed that what made America different is we always have a frontier. People can go onto the frontier and they can make a new life for themselves if they're industrious. They can be like Daniel Boone going out to what became Kentucky, but then was part of western part of the state of Virginia. Or if you're a wealthy or aspiring to be wealthy Easterner, you could invest in the frontier, like George Washington, and that could be a key to your future. So the future was always tied to the frontier, and that's why at the time of the American Revolution and independence, they cared so much about getting the areas west of the Appalachians. If you remember, one of the causes of the American Revolution was after the French and Indian War, when the British acquired secure title to the Ohio Valley from the French. The British then issued the proclamation of 1767 and closed the frontier to settlement by people from the eastern colonies. This blocked off this avenue of, what Americans viewed as their future. So that was one of the causes of the revolution. Now with the revolution over, they were so proud that they had, and so it was so important to them that they had acquired the frontier. What Washington saw was that frontier was being lost. Under the Articles of Confederation, the central government couldn't have an army, it couldn't tax, and therefore it couldn't defend the frontier. None of the states had the resources to protect their claims to the extent they had them west of the Appalachians. And the British, despite the peace treaty, had never left their forts in the frontier in what we would later call the Northwest Territories. The Spanish had closed the river at New Orleans and were moving in to the Southwest, which was allegedly American territory. The Native Americans were very distrustful of the American government, and they were pushing back. Indeed, by the time of the Constitution, most of Georgia had been reclaimed by the Native Americans, and they were moving back because there was no British army to keep them under control. Indeed, the British were providing guns to the Native Americans in the frontier. They would say, so that they could kill animals for furs and trade with the British. Of course, the Native Americans, what the Americans were saying is they can use those against settlers. Washington went out to the frontier to visit his own land shortly after the Revolution in 1784, and he found out he couldn't get to most of his territories because Native Americans had pushed back in, and they were waiting in ambush to capture him. His agent in this area had been captured and killed by the Native Americans. So there was a real threat out there. So Washington couldn't get to his own lands, or what he claimed to be his lands, and there were no troops out there to defend it. And the settlers out there, he found, weren't too interested in the United States. And they had to get their goods to market, and the way they'd get the goods to market were either through Spanish New Orleans or up through British Canada. And Washington came back from his trip, and he wrote letters to all sorts of governors around the country saying, we're losing the frontier. The frontier and the frontiersmen, and this is a quote from his letter, are as on a pivot. They are ready to swing. They could swing to the British. They could spring to the Spanish. They'll go whichever way they can trade. And we need to link up the frontier with canals, with a waterway, with a navigation system that will go over the Appalachians and connect the Ohio country, as it were, western Pennsylvania, Kentucky, those areas, with the east. Now, he thought the perfect one would go through the Potomac River by his Mount Vernon, and therefore building up the value of that area, go up through the Potomac and then connect to the Ohio River system a little bit south of Pittsburgh, and then connect up to his own lands, and he owned very large tracts in that area, or claimed to own them. And then, of course, those would become more accessible. They could get their goods to market closer. They would be tied, as it were, to the East Coast. So this became his project, building a Potomac navigation system for both personal economic reasons and also nationalistic reasons to link the frontier with the East. And this became a driving passion with him. He worked with the states of Maryland and Virginia, because the Potomac goes along the border, to get a company created, a joint stock company with limited liability for himself. He became president of that company. He hired the workers. He had hundreds of workers either deepening the river or blasting in the rapids to open up waterways or building bypass canals, some of the larger rapids. Of course, later on, the Erie Canal would be built up in New York, and it would prove a much more successful route, a much more easier route to operate, and that ended up taking a lot of the business from the Potomac Navigation Company. But this became Washington's passion, and he was on the job operating this. So talk about retirement. Not only was he managing a very large plantation with hundreds of workers, but he was also president of and the active leader of a navigation company, building a navigation system through really tough territory, because the Appalachian Mountains in that area are pretty rugged, and there's some sizable rapids on the Great Falls of the Potomac, which is it's the deepest falls, I think, on the East Coast. It's a sizable drop, but it would be back in 1780s, it would be a hellish thing to build a canal system around.
Washington also seemed to have an interest or a passion in politics. Ed mentioned that the Articles of Confederation proved to be a system of government inadequate to the needs of the new United States. And Washington took a keen interest in something called the Annapolis Convention of 1786, which was created to figure out how the United States could better sort out the Articles of Confederation so it would serve its needs. Ed, would you remind us what the Annapolis Convention was and what, if any, role Washington played in the convention?
The Annapolis Convention was a follow-up to the Mount Vernon Compact. And the Mount Vernon Compact had been an arrangement between Maryland and Virginia that originally met in Alexandria but moved to Mount Vernon and was directly under Washington's supervision, where the delegates from those two states worked out arrangements of mutual cooperation for navigation of the Potomac and interstate commerce. The important thing to remember is that under the Articles of Confederation, the central government did not have control over interstate commerce. Each state could print its own money, impose its own taxes, impose tariffs on goods passing from one state to another. The Articles of Confederation was simply a league of friendship, as that's the phrase that's between the states, and a mode for cooperation on foreign affairs. But on domestic affairs, each state went its own way. And so they could build up trade barriers that would effectively prevent there be from a national market economy. And Washington had a large plantation. And of course, he wanted to trade beyond Virginia. He did have a lot of trades overseas, but there were barriers to trade from state to state. And each state was competing against each other state for its own well-being. So the Mount Vernon Compact had broken down a lot of those barriers between Maryland and Virginia. And the inspiration for it was building this navigation system under Washington's guidance up the Potomac. And of course, you had to have joint cooperative rules. You couldn't have Maryland imposing one rules and Virginia another, because then you just couldn't simply work a navigation system, because it was a commercial trade system. So when that had worked, and they realized that by making the pie larger, everyone could profit, the idea was to call a second convention, the one in Annapolis, where all the states could get together and try to break down the barriers, basically make like a common market in Europe, a common market of the states. So they called this convention, but Washington didn't go himself, unlike the earlier one where he moved the Mount Vernon Compact actually from meeting in Alexandria to his home in Mount Vernon. Here he wasn't directly involved. Who were involved, though, was James Madison from Virginia, Alexander Hamilton from New York, and others. And it met. The trouble was they invited all the states to come, and by the time it met, only a few of the states had actually showed up. Washington wasn't involved. The people there, especially Hamilton and Madison, realized we don't have enough states present to effectively deal with the problems of interstate commerce. And really, our problems are much deeper than interstate commerce. We also need a central government that has the power to tax, to effectively control individuals, to be truly a national government. Interstate commerce is one issue, but there are more. And so rather than to go ahead with this meeting, they adjourned and called on the states to have a larger meeting a year later in Philadelphia, where they could look at all the issues of the government. And that ended up becoming the Philadelphia Convention, or what we now know as the Constitutional Convention.
Many of us recall that Washington presided over the Constitutional Convention of 1787 as its president. However, in The Return of George Washington, Ed explains that Washington almost didn't attend the convention. Ed, would you tell us how Washington came to the decision to attend the Constitutional Convention and why he almost didn't go?
Everyone involved with organizing the Philadelphia Convention or the Constitutional Convention believed that it could only succeed with Washington there. Washington had the more stature than any other single individual in the United States. He was the most trusted individual, and he was largely trusted, not only because he won the war, but largely trusted because he had resigned power. So people did not view him as coveting power. The big problem with creating a national government at the Constitutional Convention was the people were fearful of giving up their power. For remember, they'd gone through the Revolutionary War. They'd gone through the oppression of a distant government in London oppressing them, and their states had been their protectors during the years leading up to the Revolutionary War. Now they were going to be called on to voluntarily relinquish power to a central government, a distant central government, whether it be in Philadelphia, New York, or later Washington, D.C. How to get them to trust transferring significant powers from their traditional protectors, the states, to the central government. Now, they knew they needed to do this for their military defense, for protecting the frontier, for creating interstate commerce, and therefore reviving an economy, because the whole states were all in a state of recession or depression at the time because of the economic problems created by these little states and their inability to control foreign or domestic interstate commerce. So they knew there were lots of problems and how to get them to trust. Well, the key to getting them to trust was having George Washington there, because they trusted George Washington with power from his previous experience. The problem for Washington was he knew that trust only went so far. He knew he had a reputation that he wanted to defend and protect. He knew he had a limited amount of political capital. He was convinced that the central government had to be stronger. There was no person who was more prominent in this period during the Confederation. There was no one who was more critical of the Confederation, and no one who was more visibly connected with the idea that we need a stronger central government than George Washington. But he had limited capital. And so if he went and it failed, he feared, and this appeared in many of his letters, he feared that he would expend this political capital, and then there would be no one who could pull the country together, absent total chaos and a total disaster. And that was his phrases. You read his letters. He says, chaos is possible. We are facing utter collapse. Of course, we're beginning to see collapse in France during the Revolution by this time, so you could see it coming. You could see the type of chaos and collapse that could happen. And so he didn't want to expend his capital prematurely and have it fail. So he was reluctant to go until he both had a clear plan in mind. And so he wrote to John Jay, to James Madison, to Henry Knox, who was the Secretary of War, asking, what sort of government can we create? There had to be an alternative plan before he went there. It becomes known as the Virginia Plan. And second, he had to have some assurance that these delegates were willing to make that, as he called it, revolutionary. He called it a revolutionary step in government to this stronger central government. Because if he was just going to go there and watch it fail, he feared the worst for the country.
The Constitutional Convention actually deliberated over 3 plans of government. The New Jersey Plan, which favored equal representation between the states. The Virginia Plan, which based representation purely on the population residing within each state. And the Connecticut Plan, a sort of consensus plan that gave each state equal representation in the Senate and population-based representation in the House of Representatives. Ed, how did Washington and the delegates negotiate all of these varying interests, the big states, the small states, those who want a government with lots of power, and those who want the states to retain lots of power? How did they come to the consensus that is the Constitution of the United States?
The New Jersey Plan, as you describe it, was effectively sort of a patch-up of the Articles of Confederation. It retained basic power and sovereignty in the states. Now, under the Articles of Confederation, as under the Virginia Plan, each state had one vote in the central government. The only thing really different with the New Jersey Plan is that the central government now had the power to tax. It still had to be passed, each state having one vote, cast by as many delegates as they wanted to send, but these delegates were instructable by the state. So it would be like the United Nations. Certainly, U.S. can send a whole bunch of delegates to the UN. Togo can send one. They each get one vote. But the ambassador to the UN from the United States doesn't decide how they're going to vote. The president tells them how to vote, or the Secretary of State tells them how to vote. And that was how the Articles of Confederation worked. So literally, it would be a conclave of the states. It would have the power to tax, which was important, so it could raise funds for the central government and therefore hopefully defend the frontier and do a few things, but only if the states consented. Now, the Virginia Plan, as you describe it, was a true national government. It would consolidate all the fundamental powers in the central government, and the people from the whole Union would vote on delegates to the lower house. The lower house would choose the upper house, and those legislators would choose the president. So the big states would have a lot more power because they had more people. It all depends if you count slaves or not, of course. Virginia wouldn't have nearly as many people if you didn't count its slaves, but Pennsylvania would, and Massachusetts would. Those were the three most populated states at the time. And indeed, if you throw in New York, those four states would have a majority of the people at the time. So they would pick the representatives, that group would pick the senators, and they would have the power to tax. These elected delegates would serve terms in office. They would not be responsive to the states. The states couldn't tell them how to vote. They would be paid by the central government. Their allegiances would be presumably to the central government. They would not be agents of the state. They would be a separate government. They would be sovereign. Indeed, the strongest proponents of this plan, Alexander Hamilton of New York, wanted to abolish the states altogether and create administrative districts, which of course later happened in France after the revolution in France. The backers in Pennsylvania, people like Gouverneur and Robert Morris, basically felt the same way. So did James Madison at this point. So there you had the Virginia plan, two fundamentally different plans. Everybody who went there, if you looked at them privately, everyone knew the compromise, because they knew they had to have a lower house and an upper house, because all the states, well, not all the states, not Pennsylvania, a couple states didn't, but most states had a lower house and an upper house. That was the tradition in England, where you had the House of Commons and the then still powerful House of Lords. Everyone knew when they got there that the obvious compromise was to have the lower house picked by the people and the upper house picked by the states. Ben Franklin knew that. Washington knew that. They all knew that was the compromise. The question was how to get to that compromise. The small states, of course, like the idea of the power of the states. They tended to back the New Jersey plan. The big states, most of them, not New York, but most of the big states tended to back the Virginia plan. And of course, they're both staking out the most extreme positions, but they all know the ultimate central point is this sort of mixed states in the one, population in the other. And so Ben Franklin is the one who sort of first formulates it, but he passes it on to Roger Sherman of Connecticut because it's better coming from a middle state. And Washington was involved in helping to broker the compromise to that position, even though he was publicly committed to the Virginia plan. He had been one of the authors. We don't know exactly how the Virginia plan was written because it was private meetings when it came out, but Washington, we know, was at every one of those meetings. He never missed one of the meetings, and the earlier genesis of it was James Madison, but James Madison, at the time he was working on it, was actually living at Mount Vernon, staying at Mount Vernon for a couple months with Washington. So Washington was involved with the Virginia plan throughout, but he had been a political general. He had worked out with a smaller army, he had defeated a bigger army by negotiating, by compromising, by keeping people in play, by keeping state militias involved, by being very resourceful. This was the sort of politician he was, and this was a role he played in Philadelphia to help get all the people moving toward a compromise plan that would still effectuate the key things that he thought were necessary. That is, a central government that had power to tax individuals, that had power to control individuals, that had the power to dictate to states, had the power over interstate commerce, had the power over foreign affairs, had an army, and yet left other aspects of life and of government to the states. The question was getting all the delegates to this new vision of a government.
One of the problems embedded in the plans for representation is how should slaves count? In The Return of George Washington, Ed points out that Washington stood as one of the largest slaveholders in Virginia, even though after the Revolution, the idea of slavery made him uncomfortable. Ed, given Washington's views on slavery, where did he stand on the 3/5 debate? And would you just remind us what that debate was about?
The 3/5 compromise, as it was called, the debate over the 3/5 compromise, was probably second maybe to the big state, small state compromise, the biggest issue at the Constitutional Convention. We tend to think of the slavery issue erupting at the Civil War, but actually it erupted at the Constitutional Convention because before the war, every state had slavery. During the war and in the immediate aftermath of the war, most of the northern states had either abolished slavery or moving toward the abolition of slavery. It did not, to them, to so many people, seem compatible with their notions of freedom and liberty that were tied up in the revolutionary struggle. Ben Franklin is a good example of this. He actually had slaves, a few house slaves earlier in his career, but he turns totally against slavery and founds one of the first abolitionist society in America. So he's a strong opponent of slavery by this time, as was Alexander Hamilton in New York. Washington hadn't really thought about slavery much before the war. But during the war, in this revolutionary fervor of the war, many of his aides, most trusted aides, like Alexander Hamilton, for example, who I just mentioned, but also Lafayette from France, the Marquis de Lafayette, who was strongly opposed to slavery, Henry Laurens of South Carolina, who strongly opposed slavery. These were Washington's aides, and they were telling him, and so were others, how all these notions of freedom and liberty and equality, how can all these notions be compatible with you being a slave owner? And so Washington had grown uncomfortable with the concept of slavery. At least he got to the point where he thought that it wasn't an efficient system, but it was the system that he'd inherited. It was the system that was the foundation of his livelihood. He owned a couple hundred slaves, and his wife owned even more. And so they had quite a large holding between his wife and himself. It's how his plantation operated, and what would happen to all these slaves if you ended slavery. So Washington was troubled and torn by the issue, but he knew the South was economically and in many cases morally and philosophically tied to this idea of slavery. But, your economics never get too far from your values. And he knew that the South would not, or he believed that the South would not accept the Constitutional Convention if it gave the power of the central government to somehow abolish slavery or oppose slavery. So he ends up supporting various different provisions that help preserve slavery, such as the Fugitive Slave Clause that directs the central government and empowers the central government to recollect fugitive slaves who leave a slave territory and go off to a free state like a Pennsylvania or a Massachusetts. Now, the Three-Fifths Compromise was the trickiest part of this whole deal, because if we're going to have the lower house of Congress divided by population, who counts as a person? Of course, the southern states want to count the slave as a whole person. They're not going to let them vote. Each state has the power to determine who can vote. So some states like New Jersey allow women to vote, for example. Most states don't allow women to vote. But if you're going to count the slaves, of course, since half the people in South Carolina and 40% of the people in Virginia were slaves, you're going to have a lot larger number. So you're going to get a lot more members of the House of Representatives if you divide the number of House of Representatives by your population. Now, the Northerners are totally opposed to it because they're saying, you're not treating these slaves as people. We think they're people. Our free blacks count, and nobody doubts that a free African American would count as a full person because they're a free person. But should a enslaved person count? And the North doesn't have any slaves, or they're quickly ending slavery. There's still a few slaves left in New York and a couple places, but they're not many. We don't think you should count them because you're not letting them vote. You're not treating them as people. Of course, they want to have the more House seats themselves. And it's not just House seats because it, of course, factors into the Electoral College, so it's how many votes you have for president as well. And so there's a battle over should it be zero, should slaves count or not. And you have some amazing lines like Gouverneur Morris said, well, if you get to count your slaves, then we should be able to count our cows. He's not saying, he's against slavery. He's not saying a slave is a cow. He's saying you're treating them like cows. So why can't we count our cows as people? And this is the sort of debate was happening. And the compromise, the Three-Fifths Compromise, was that each slave, for the purpose of representation, counts as 3/5 of a person. It had never been enacted, but during the Articles of Confederation, when they had proposed a couple tax plans, a way to raise revenue, one of the proposals was it would be a per capita tax, and the slaves would count as 3/5 of a person for collecting taxes from the various different states. And so this was adapted, picked up. It could have just easily been 1/2. Of course, there were proposals to make it 1/2 and 1/5 and 3/5 and every other number. But the compromise that resolved that kept the southern states in, and Washington supported it because he supported all the other provisions dealing with slavery, were to count as 3/5 of a person. And of course, the Southerners wanted a whole, wanted it to be 100%. The Northerners wanted to be near zero, but it's a classic political compromise that we can look back on and we say, but they're talking about people. And of course, you get that then too. People like Gouverneur Morris are saying, but we're talking about people here. How can we do this? And yet, what did they say? That, when you see legislation being made, like sausage being made, it's a gruesome thing. But this is the way these people were thinking. This was one of the compromises that allowed them to get a constitution that would be accepted both in the North and the South.
From the start, Washington believed that if a strong central government was approved of, if they ratified the Constitution, he would be elected the first president. What role did Washington play in the ratification of the Constitution?
Washington played a central role in the ratification of the Constitution. Washington was constantly writing letters to leaders throughout the various states. Of course, he had led the Revolutionary War, and there were soldiers and officers from all the states, and he knew officers throughout. He'd worked with many of the governors. He was very well connected around in fact, he was probably the only person, this was an era before mass communications, he was probably the only person with close contacts in every state who he'd worked with and knew personally, and he called on all those people to support the revolution. So he was actively involved in letter writing. He didn't want to appear publicly to be questing after the presidency, and he didn't really covet the presidency, but he did strongly believe that this country could only survive with the Constitution. It would make it look like he was just trying to be president if he publicly entered the fray. So he wrote a lot of private letters. He also called on his friends, people like John Jay and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, to write public articles, publish articles either under their own name or under a pseudonym like Publicus, making the public case. He would redistribute those articles. He would gather up articles and have them sent in, and then send them out and ask other newspapers to publish them. When it really got tough, when you had really close battles, such as in Massachusetts, he would send letters for publication publicly announcing his support. He urged people to go to their state ratifying conventions. He basically ordered James Madison to stand for election and go to the Virginia State Ratifying Convention to answer Patrick Henry item by item and defend this Constitution. So he was somewhat behind the scenes, but tremendously committed. In some ways, he was the clearinghouse. Mount Vernon became the clearinghouse for the ratification campaign.
Let's transition to the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if George Washington had opted not to attend the Constitutional Convention? Would the Constitution have been written? What would the structure of the government and the unity of the United States be like today?
In the short run, if Washington hadn't attended the Constitutional Convention, it probably would have failed. It probably would, without the strength of his character. It almost fell apart even with the strength of his character. But without the strength of his character and without his stature in the front seat and his behind-the-scenes negotiation of various deals, it probably would have fallen apart. Again, it was such a close race anyway. And when the Constitution is written, it still has to be ratified by the states. And by the states, it meant by state ratifying conventions, popular conventions called by each state legislature. If you look at the campaign for ratification, in virtually every state, the main argument for it is, look, Washington backs this. Washington and Franklin back this. They're the authors of your liberty. How can it be bad? You can trust it. Without the ability to see this as a product of Washington's hands or Washington and Franklin's hands, these national heroes, it's hard to see how ratification would have happened. Indeed, after it was over, James Monroe, a later president of the United States, but who was rabidly against ratification, was one of the lead figures in Virginia against ratification. He said afterwards, mark my words, Washington carried this Constitution. Without Washington, it would not have been ratified in Virginia. It was a close call as it was. It likely wouldn't have been ratified in Massachusetts. It wouldn't have happened. Now, that doesn't mean that Washington single-handedly did it. Madison was in many ways the key architect. Gouverneur Morris came up with, and James Wilson from Pennsylvania devised most of the intricate features that we live with today that were critical to making it work, from the Electoral College all the way through to the way various details work. A person like Franklin was deeply involved. Hamilton. There were so many people who were critical to making this convention work. But Washington was first among many, in some ways the general contractor who keeps the whole thing working. And it was that team. Washington was always a team player. He was always typically the leader of it, but whether it was going into battle, he'd always hold conferences with all his lieutenants. When he became president, he invented the concept of a cabinet, because that's provisions not in the Constitution. That's the way he led. That's the way he worked. He always worked with others. He listened. He compromised. That was the sort of leader he was, and that's the role he played at the Constitution Convention. If you take him out, everything's going to be so different that it's not going to work now. But you ask, how would it be different today? Well, Washington was clear that the whole system under the Articles of Confederation was doomed to failure. So if it hadn't worked this time, would they have later gotten together? We don't know. I mean, there you're into a level of speculation that goes beyond my ability as a historian. I think it's likely that the Confederation would have broken up, and you would have had some sort of a Southern Confederation. That's what Patrick Henry was pushing for. And you would have sort of a New England Confederation. Some of the parts might have rejoined with Europeans. The Southwest may well have gone with Spain. Vermont was already conspiring with the British to rejoin British Canada. So you might have seen a breakup of the whole. That's a real possibility. The other possibility would have been, after it got worse, that they'd try again and they'd come up with some other system. Which of those was more likely? I think probably the breakup, but I'm not sure.
You seem to have a strong interest in the early national period. Will your next book cover that period?
Probably not. What I tend to do is move around, but I'll be back in the early national period, the late colonial period, the revolutionary period. I just want to probably take a breath here and do one transitional book and then be back.
Where is the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how we can contact you if we have questions?
Any of your listeners can, of course, contact me by email. That's the easiest way to get through to me. You can just do Ed Larson, my name, Ed Larson at uga.edu. And that's probably the easiest way if you want to get a message right to me.
Thank you so much for letting us into this understudied period of George Washington's life.
Well, thank you for having me on the show, and I wish you great fortune with the idea. It's a beautiful concept.
George Washington understood retirement in a way that differs from how many of us think about that period of our lives. Of course, as someone who dislikes being idle for too long, I admire his work ethic and visions for the future. Even in retirement, Washington tried to unite his country, whether it was through inland navigation or his substantial activities to reshape the government of the United States. Washington was hard at work. During his work to craft the new government, Washington saw the contradictions of his ideas. How could he help build a country on the foundation of liberty and equality while he and others practiced slavery at home? Conflicting ideas are not easy to face, but Washington rose to the challenge, and after many years of grappling with these ideological contradictions, he decided that he couldn't support the ideas of liberty and equality while also practicing slavery. So as we learned from Douglas Bradburn in episode 33, Washington bequeathed his slaves their freedom upon the death of his wife, Martha. You can find more information about Ed, his book, The Return of George Washington, plus links to other episodes that discuss topics raised during today's conversation on the blog post page for this episode, benfranklinsworld.com/061. Did you know that Ben Franklin's World has an app, and that app is free? The app is available for both Android and Apple smartphone and tablet devices. To get the app, all you need to do is visit your preferred app store and search Ben Franklin or Ben Franklin's World, or visit benfranklinsworld.com/apps and click on the link to download the app that's right for you. I have some exciting things planned for this podcast and for the Ben Franklin's World listener community in 2016. If you would like to be among the first to know what my plans are, text BF World to 33444 to subscribe to the Franklin Gazette and to join the listener community on Facebook. You can also subscribe by clicking the Join Now button at benfranklinsworld.com. You can't miss the button. It's bright orange, and right above it is a picture of Ben Franklin's iconic Join or Die snake. Finally, we had many episodes that covered George Washington in 2015. Which historical figure do you think deserves multiple episodes in 2016? Send your answers to Liz at benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me at Liz Covart, or post a comment on the show notes page for this episode, or in Poor Richard's Club.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.